Why did one man, just one, write nearly half of the New Testament? Not a king, not a general, not even one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. Yet his words have shaped theology, sparked debates, divided churches, and inspired billions across centuries. His name was Paul, and his letters were never meant to be Bible verses. They were urgent, personal, emotional, sometimes angry, sometimes deeply loving, always intentional. So why did Paul write so many letters? And more importantly, why do they still matter today? To understand Paul's letters, you have to understand his world. The first century was chaotic. The Roman Empire ruled most of the known world. Culture was diverse, but power was centralized. Communication was slow. Travel was dangerous. And Christianity? It wasn't a religion yet. It was a fragile movement. Small groups of believers scattered across cities like Corinth, Ephesus, Rome, and Galatia. There were no churches as we know them, no official doctrines, no New Testament, just communities trying to figure out what it meant to follow Jesus. And that's where Paul comes in. Paul wasn't just a preacher. He was a church planter. He would travel to a city, share the message of Jesus, help form a community, and then leave. But leaving created a problem. What happens when new believers start asking questions? What happens when disagreements arise? What happens when culture clashes with faith? Paul couldn't just send a text message, so he wrote letters. Paul's letters weren't optional reading. They were lifelines. Imagine you're part of a new Christian community in Corinth. You've come from a background filled with pagan rituals, social divisions, and moral confusion. Now you're told to live a completely different way. But no one really explains how. So questions start flooding in. Is it okay to eat food offered to idols? What about marriage? How should we handle conflict? Who's in charge? And sometimes, things got messy, very messy. So Paul writes, not like a philosopher, but like a pastor. He corrects, encourages, challenges, guides. In one letter, he might celebrate their faith. In the next, he might confront serious issues. And sometimes, he does both in the same paragraph. These letters were deeply personal. He mentions names, situations, specific problems. He laughs. He cries. He pleads. This wasn't abstract theology. This was real life. If everything was going smoothly, Paul wouldn't need to write. But things were far from smooth. Let's look at some of the major issues Paul addressed. 1. Division and ego. In some churches, people were forming factions. I follow Paul. I follow Apollos. I follow someone else. It became about personalities instead of truth. Paul had to step in and remind them, it's not about leaders. It's about Christ too. Moral confusion. Some believers were struggling to leave behind old lifestyles. Others were going too far in the opposite direction, becoming legalistic. Paul had to balance grace and discipline, not an easy task. 3. False teachings. This was a big one. Different teachers were spreading conflicting ideas about Jesus. Some said faith wasn't enough. Others distorted the message entirely. Paul's letters became a defense of truth. 4. Cultural pressure. The early Christians didn't live in isolation. They were surrounded by powerful cultural expectations. Roman society valued status, power, and hierarchy. Paul's message challenged all of that. He taught humility, equality, sacrifice, and that created tension. Point 5. Suffering and persecution following Jesus wasn't safe. Many believers faced rejection, loss, and even death. Paul's letters often encouraged them to endure, to stay strong, to remember that their faith had a purpose beyond their circumstances. So why did Paul's letters have such a lasting impact? Because they weren't just answers. They were frameworks. Paul didn't just tell people what to do. He explained why. He connected behavior to belief, action to identity. For example, instead of just saying, "Be kind," he would say, "Be kind because of who you are now." Instead of just saying, "Don't sin," he would explain how sin affects your relationship with God and others. He went deeper. He built understanding. And that's why his letters could be read not just once, but for generations. Now, here's the big question. Why should we care today? After all, we live in a completely different world, different culture, different challenges. So what makes Paul's letters still relevant? Because the core struggles haven't changed. People still deal with identity, conflict, purpose, morality, doubt, pressure. From society, Paul's context was ancient. But human nature isn't. His letters speak to the same inner battles we face today. And maybe more importantly, they show us how to think, not just what to believe. In a world full of noise, opinions, and confusion, Paul's letters offer clarity. They challenge us. They comfort us. They push us to grow. Paul never imagined that his letters would one day be read by millions. He wasn't sitting in a quiet study, carefully crafting a religious masterpiece for future generations. He was often tired, sometimes imprisoned, frequently misunderstood. And yet, he kept writing, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. He wrote to people he loved, people who were struggling, questioning, failing, growing, people trying to make sense of their faith in a complicated, often hostile world. And in many ways, that hasn't changed. Today, we live in a different kind of empire, not ruled by Rome, but by information, distraction, and endless noise. We're constantly being told who to be, what to believe, how to live. And just like those early believers, we feel the pressure, the confusion, the pull in different directions. And that's why Paul's letters still speak, because beneath all the history, the culture, the ancient language, they are deeply human. They speak to doubt, to identity, to failure, to hope. They remind us that faith isn't about perfection. It's about transformation, slow, messy, real. Paul didn't write to perfect people. He wrote to broken communities, people who argued, who made mistakes, who sometimes got it completely wrong. And yet, he never gave up on them. He challenged them, yes, but he also believed in who they could become. And maybe that's the most powerful part of all, because when we read his letters today, we're not just reading history, we're stepping into a conversation about what it means to live with purpose, to stand firm when everything around you is shifting, to choose truth over comfort, to grow even when it's hard, and maybe to become something more than we are right now. So the next time you come across one of Paul's letters, don't rush through it. Don't reduce it to a quote or a rule. Sit with it. Feel the weight behind the words. Imagine the people who first heard them, the struggles they faced, the questions they asked, and then ask yourself, what is this saying to me today? Because somehow, across centuries of time, distance, and change, these letters are still alive, still challenging, still guiding, still calling us to think deeper, live differently, and become better. Not overnight, but one step at a time, just like them. Asterisk. Soft fade out. And maybe that's why Paul wrote so many letters. Because the message was never meant for just one moment. It was meant for every generation, including ours.